Anne did not summon cameras, leak accusations, or seek allies. She allegedly walked directly into a private meeting with Camilla, carrying the documents herself. What followed was not a shouting match, but something far more dangerous, a calm confrontation over who truly belonged inside the monarchy's protected inner circle. Anne had chosen privacy for a reason. If too many aides were present, the dispute could be softened into procedure, buried beneath polite language and passed from desk to desk until nobody was responsible. She wanted no such escape. This was not, in her mind, an argument about invitations or family feelings. It was about where private affection ended and royal privilege began. She put the issue plainly. Camilla's marriage to the sovereign had given her a unique constitutional and ceremonial role, one protected by the crown itself. But Anne reportedly refused to accept that this position automatically extended to Camilla's children or wider relatives simply because they stood close to the queen. Proximity, Anne believed, was not inheritance. Camilla pushed back. Her family, she argued, had spent years living under public suspicion, criticism, and relentless comparison. To keep treating them like outsiders whenever the royal family gathered privately was, in her view, another form of exclusion. And beneath that argument sat something more painful. Camilla reportedly felt that no matter how many years passed, she and those closest to her would forever be forced to answer for a history they could not rewrite. Anne heard the emotion, but she did not surrender to it. To her, sympathy could not become policy. Personal suffering could not quietly create institutional entitlement. And when the conversation moved toward royal jewels and historic possessions, Anne became even more uncompromising. These were not ordinary family objects. Some were tied to former royal women, others to state history, succession, or deeply sensitive memories that still carried emotional weight decades later. Then came the detail that changed the temperature of the entire meeting. Anne had learned that an heirloom associated with Diana had allegedly been requested for examination while preparations were being made for an upcoming private royal occasion. There was no accusation of theft, no suggestion that anyone had secretly taken the piece. But Anne wanted to know why someone outside the recognized working royal structure was even being discussed in connection with such a collection. The mention of Diana reportedly struck a nerve. Camilla warned Anne that constantly returning to the past guaranteed the family would never escape it. Every decision, every jewel, every private gathering risked becoming another trial over wounds that had never fully healed. But Anne's reply was colder. Preserving boundaries, she argued, was not the same as preserving resentment. It was about preventing private relationships from slowly rewriting royal inheritance. The meeting ended without agreement. Camilla believed Charles would intervene and refuse any measure that could humiliate her family. Anne had already moved beyond that possibility. She instructed palace officials to prepare formal restrictions until clear rules could be established. Camilla believed Charles would stop Anne before those restrictions ever became real, but Anne had anticipated that possibility, and she was preparing to force the king to choose between peace at home and the boundaries of the crown. The order was never meant to become public, yet inside royal circles its meaning was unmistakable. Certain invitations were frozen, private access was narrowed, sensitive rooms were placed under stricter control, and suddenly the Parker Bowles family understood that Princess Anne had done what nobody else had dared to do. Anne moved carefully. She did not write a rule naming Camilla's family directly, because that would have made the dispute look personal from the very beginning. Instead, she worked through senior household figures and pushed for a temporary restriction based on status. The language was cold, precise, and difficult to challenge. people without an official royal role would face tighter limits around ceremonial spaces, secure collections, and historically sensitive areas. On paper, it sounded administrative. Inside the palace, it felt like a declaration of war. Guest lists for upcoming private gatherings were quietly revised. Access arrangements were reviewed. Traditions that had once allowed Camilla's relatives to move more freely around royal family occasions were suddenly being questioned. What had previously rested on familiarity and goodwill was now being tested against rank, protocol, and precedent. For Camilla, the message was impossible to misunderstand. She reportedly saw Anne's move as calculated humiliation. Her family had already spent years trying to find a place around the edges of royal life. And now, just as that position seemed more settled, the door was being pushed shut again. Charles was furious. He believed Anne had acted before he had been given the chance to calm the dispute privately. Yet his anger was weakened by one uncomfortable problem. Anne's written reasoning was solid enough that simply overruling her could create a far bigger issue. If personal relationships were allowed to define royal access, where would the line be drawn in the future? That question immediately pulled William into the tension. He did not openly side with Anne. Doing so would have made the family split impossible to hide. But privately, he strongly favored clearer boundaries between the monarch's personal family life and the hereditary institution itself. Catherine's position was quieter, but no less important. She understood that whatever rule Charles accepted now could one day become the rule William inherited. Meanwhile, frustration grew on the Parker Bowles side. The argument spreading through private conversations was sharp. The Windsors were protecting their own bloodline while expecting Camilla's children to remain permanently one step outside, no matter how many years they had been part of the king's life. Anne would not bend. She insisted that kindness did not require ceremonial equality, and family inclusion did not have to become institutional privilege. But just as the palace settled into that bitter division, word of the confrontation traveled far beyond its walls. Harry reportedly learned what had happened through a family contact, and that changed everything. Everyone assumed Harry would seize the crisis as another reason to attack the monarchy, but instead he focused on one detail buried inside Anne's objections, and that detail pulled Diana's legacy directly into the center of the battle. Harry had spent years accusing the institution of protecting itself at the expense of people. Yet when he heard what Anne was trying to stop, something changed. One reference involving Diana's personal legacy reportedly caught his attention, and suddenly the estranged prince wanted answers from the palace itself. At first, Harry reportedly viewed the entire confrontation with suspicion. From a distance, it sounded painfully familiar. Another royal struggle over access, hierarchy, status, and who was allowed to stand closest to power. He had spent too long fighting those systems to feel any natural sympathy for tighter palace restrictions. But then one detail reached him, and the argument stopped being abstract. Diana's name was connected to the disputed collection. That changed everything. Harry immediately began asking questions. Had any items closely associated with his mother been moved? Had something been requested for examination? Had ownership descriptions been altered? Was a Diana-linked piece being considered for a future ceremony, private gathering, or symbolic display? The questions came quickly because, to Harry, this was no longer about Anne defending royal protocol. It was about whether his mother's memory was being quietly absorbed into a story she had never chosen. And suddenly, against almost every expectation, Harry and Anne were standing near the same line. Their reasons were different. Anne wanted to protect institutional boundaries. Harry had spent years challenging those very boundaries. Yet both appeared deeply uncomfortable with the idea that Diana's belongings, image, or emotional legacy could be used without clear understanding from those most closely tied to her. What surprised the palace even more was Harry's next move. He did not immediately release a statement. He did not turn the dispute into a public accusation. Instead, he contacted an intermediary and asked for clarification. He reportedly wanted a clean distinction between crown property, historic royal objects, items connected personally to Diana, and possessions that might carry emotional claims beyond their legal classification. When Anne heard about the questions, she was taken aback. She had expected Harry to see her restrictions as another example of the system closing ranks. Instead, he was examining the same weakness she had identified. Once the boundaries became vague, memory itself could become a form of influence. That possibility deeply unsettled Camilla's side. Anne and Harry were hardly natural allies. If Diana's legacy created even temporary common ground between them, the dispute could become far more dangerous than anyone had planned. Charles now found himself squeezed from every direction. He wanted to protect Camilla from humiliation. He was angry with Anne for forcing the issue. And beneath both pressures sat an older, more painful fear that Harry might believe his mother's history was once again being managed without him. Then, Harry reportedly found the reference that pushed him further. A specific piece of jewelry appeared in the documentation, with wording vague enough to leave its future use open to interpretation. Harry did not go public. He asked to speak directly with Anne. That request stunned the palace, because Anne and Harry had rarely stood on the same side of a royal dispute, but their private conversation would transform a family argument into a much larger confrontation over memory, inheritance, and control. Princess Anne represented everything Harry once claimed he wanted to escape: discipline, hierarchy, silence, and unquestioning duty. Yet now, they shared one fear: that Diana's legacy could be quietly reshaped by people who had never carried the emotional cost of losing her. Their alliance shocked everyone around them. The conversation began cautiously. Neither Anne nor Harry entered it with complete trust. Anne questioned whether Harry truly wanted clarity, or whether the dispute might eventually become another public attack on the institution. Harry, meanwhile, suspected Anne's concern could simply be another attempt to defend royal control under the language of duty. But as they spoke, the distance between their positions became more complicated. Anne made one thing clear: Diana was only part of the problem. Her deeper concern was what happened when closeness to the sovereign began to look like royal status itself. If that line disappeared, she argued, every future monarch could face pressure from spouses, children from previous relationships, relatives, and private family networks seeking influence over ceremonies, residences, collections, and traditions. Harry challenged her immediately. The monarchy, he argued, had never applied its rules with perfect fairness. Some people had been protected, others pushed aside, and tradition had often been used selectively depending on who the institution wanted to defend. Anne did not deny that painful mistakes had been made, but she insisted that removing boundaries altogether would not correct those failures. It would create a different kind of chaos. That honesty changed the tone. Harry then revealed what mattered most to him. Diana's belongings, he said, could never be turned into symbols of reconciliation, continuity, or royal legitimacy without him and William understanding exactly what was being done. Whatever the legal status of a jewel or object, its emotional meaning could not simply be rewritten for convenience. Anne agreed. From that point, the two found unexpected common ground. They pushed for a formal inventory review, separating crown property, private Windsor possessions, Diana-related items, and pieces whose ownership or ceremonial use remained unclear. William was informed. and his quiet support made the situation far more serious. For the first time in the dispute, Anne, Harry, and William were temporarily aligned around one demand: clarity. Charles immediately understood the danger. A review that sounded technical could reopen arguments the family had avoided for decades. Camilla saw something even more personal. To her, the audit felt less like administration and more like a judgment on whether her place beside Charles could ever be separated from Diana's shadow. The Parker Bowles family grew frustrated as well. They were no longer being discussed as relatives with long-standing personal bonds, but as part of a wider problem involving access, precedent, and royal legitimacy. Then the review produced the discovery everyone had feared. There was no proof of wrongdoing, no missing jewel, no secret transfer. But one Diana-linked piece had apparently been considered for a future royal occasion, and the wording around that possible use was vague enough to raise deeply uncomfortable questions. The jewel itself was valuable, but the wording attached to it was far more dangerous because whoever controlled its future use could also control what Diana's memory was made to represent. One jewel now threatened to do what years of carefully managed appearances had avoided: force Diana, Camilla, Charles, William, Harry, and Anne into the same unresolved story. The question was no longer who could wear it. The question was who had the moral authority to decide. The piece at the center of the dispute was not simply valuable. Its official status and its emotional meaning pointed in different directions, and that was exactly what made it so dangerous. On paper, the jewel could be described through ownership, custody, and royal tradition. But to William and Harry, anything closely associated with Diana carried something no inventory could measure. Palace records reportedly suggested the jewel had been discussed for inclusion in a broader historical display or ceremonial presentation, one intended to represent continuity across generations. To some advisors, that language sounded harmless, even respectful. To Anne, it was precisely the problem. She believed Diana's memory could not be quietly folded into a new family narrative simply because the symbolism looked elegant. If the piece was used to suggest unity between different chapters of royal history, Anne feared it would blur pain that had never truly been resolved. Harry's reaction was sharper. To him, even the possibility felt like an attempt to make Diana's difficult history easier for the institution to live with. Her struggles, her isolation, and the emotional wounds surrounding her life could not simply be polished into a message of continuity. William was calmer, but his position carried equal weight. He did not want the jewel turned into a weapon against Camilla, yet he agreed that his mother's legacy should never become a political tool inside the family. Charles insisted there had been no malicious intention, no secret plan, no effort to erase or rewrite Diana. But that defense only exposed the deeper problem. Everyone around him was looking at the same past and seeing something completely different. For Camilla, the argument became deeply personal. She reportedly felt devastated by the suggestion that any object linked to Diana must automatically become forbidden territory around her. She had spent decades living beneath the shadow of that history, and she could not accept the idea that time had somehow stopped in 1997. Anne understood the burden more than she admitted, but sympathy did not change her position. The question, she insisted, was not whether Camilla deserved peace. It was whether emotional reconciliation could override institutional boundaries. The Parker Bowles family now pushed Charles to act. If he allowed Anne's restrictions to stand, they warned, it would confirm the perception that they were permanent outsiders. Charles began considering an order to lift them. Then Harry intervened. His private message was unmistakable. If the restrictions disappeared before the Diana inventory was resolved, he was prepared to speak publicly. But instead of attacking, Harry proposed something nobody expected: a joint family settlement involving William. Harry had finally found a weapon more powerful than public criticism: cooperation. And when William agreed to hear him out, Charles realized the dispute could no longer be dismissed as Anne's rebellion. The palace prepared for another interview, another accusation, perhaps another devastating public statement from California. None came. Instead, Harry reportedly offered William and Anne a private agreement, and its terms threatened to permanently redefine how spouses, relatives, jewels, and inheritance would be handled inside the monarchy. Harry's proposal was striking because it did not begin with a demand for revenge. He suggested that he, William, Anne, and representatives of the king establish a written protocol covering Diana-related possessions and other historically sensitive royal heirlooms. The aim, he argued, should be clarity before emotion, because confusion had already allowed suspicion to spread through the family. Then came the concession nobody expected. Harry did not demand personal control over everything connected to Diana. He did not insist that every jewel, letter, or private object be handed to him and William. Instead, he wanted transparent rules that would stop any side from using their mother's legacy for symbolism, legitimacy, or private advantage without consultation. William was reportedly surprised. He had expected Harry to turn the dispute into another attack on Charles and Camilla. Instead, Harry was proposing a system that could outlast all of them. Even more unexpectedly, he backed Anne's central argument. Relatives connected to the sovereign through marriage should not automatically gain institutional privileges simply because of family closeness. The irony was impossible to miss. Harry, who had spent years rejecting royal restrictions, was now defending a boundary designed to protect the crown from informal influence. But Harry reportedly explained that his position came from experience. Unclear rules, he believed, created resentment. They encouraged leaks, favoritism, private deals, and competing expectations. In his mind, those same conditions had helped destroy trust between him and the institution. William began to see the wider significance. If written carefully, the proposal could settle the immediate crisis while creating a framework for future reigns, including his own. Anne wanted it stronger. She pushed for a clause stating that historically sensitive jewels could never be used for personal symbolism without consultation from those most directly connected to their legacy. That demand placed even more pressure on Charles. He understood the danger immediately. Rejecting the agreement could do something he had spent years trying to prevent: bring William and Harry together against him on a major family issue. Camilla saw a different threat. Accepting the proposal might make Anne's original restrictions appear justified and permanently limit the position her family had slowly built around royal life. Then, Harry made his most unexpected move. Privately, he asked Anne not to humiliate Camilla or her children. Boundaries, he argued, should protect the institution, not become punishment. Anne was stunned. Harry was defending Diana's legacy while also shielding Camilla's family from needless public damage. Harry had changed the conflict from a battle over exclusion into a test of fairness, but fairness would demand concessions from everyone. And Camilla was about to be asked to surrender something she believed her family had already earned. By the time the final meeting began, nobody had truly won. Anne had drawn her line. Harry had unexpectedly crossed back into royal negotiations. William had chosen structure over silence. Camilla felt her family's acceptance slipping away. And Charles faced a decision that could alter the monarchy long after his reign. Charles reportedly brought the dispute back behind closed doors, this time with senior household advisors, Anne, William, and Camilla present, while Harry joined through a confidential channel. The atmosphere was no longer about who had started the conflict. Too much had happened. The question now was whether the family could create rules strong enough to end it without leaving one side permanently humiliated. The first compromise was carefully designed. Anne's restrictions on historically sensitive areas would remain, but the language would be rewritten so the measures could not be interpreted as a punishment aimed only at the Parker Bowles family. Instead, the same boundaries would apply to all non-royal relatives connected through marriage. That changed everything. Access to royal jewels, archives, private correspondence, and ceremonial collections would now require clearer institutional approval. Diana-associated objects would receive another layer of protection. If any item strongly connected to her was considered for symbolic or ceremonial use, William and Harry would be consulted before a final decision. Camilla accepted the settlement, but not without pain. Officially, her children would no longer appear to have been singled out. Privately, however, she understood what the crisis had revealed. Becoming queen had placed her at the center of the monarchy, but it had never automatically brought her entire family inside the same circle. Anne refused to apologize for forcing that distinction into the open. Yet Harry's intervention had changed her approach. She agreed that boundaries should never become weapons of humiliation. Rules could be firm without becoming revenge. William, meanwhile, emerged as the quiet force behind what came next. He reportedly saw the settlement not simply as a solution for Charles's reign, but as a framework for the future. The monarch's private relationships and the hereditary institution, he believed, could coexist only if the line between them remained unmistakable. Charles was left facing the hardest truth of all. His desire to keep peace between the people he loved had allowed certain boundaries to remain vague for too long. By avoiding confrontation, he had created space for a far larger one. And then there was Harry. Instead of unleashing another public royal war, he had helped build a compromise strong enough to protect Diana's legacy while preventing Camilla's family from being personally destroyed. That was the move nobody had expected. But the settlement did not erase the damage. Camilla now knew acceptance had limits. Anne knew the rules had changed relationships around Charles forever. And the palace had learned that its greatest threats did not always come from outside its gates. Sometimes they began when affection, inheritance, loyalty, and privilege became impossible to separate. The immediate ban had become a broader royal protocol, but the question it exposed remained dangerously alive. If Harry could unexpectedly stand beside Anne to defend the monarchy's boundaries, what other alliances might form when the next battle over inheritance, memory, and the crown finally begins?